He thought he was searching for a place to sleep. He never knew he was about to uncover a promise buried beneath the desert for more than a century. The morning sun stretched across the empty Nevada desert as Ethan Walker stood beside his old pickup truck, watching the wind move through the dry grass. The world around him was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that made a person remember everything they had lost. Ethan was 58 years old, a former U.S. Marine who once lived by discipline, purpose, and duty. He had spent years serving his country, believing that every sacrifice had meaning. But after leaving the military, life became harder than he ever expected. The routines disappeared. The people he trusted moved on. And slowly, Ethan found himself living day by day inside an aging truck that carried everything he owned. Most people who passed him only saw a homeless veteran. They saw an old jacket, a worn vehicle, and a man standing alone beneath the desert sky. They never saw the years he spent protecting others. They never saw the kindness he still carried. But Ranger saw everything. The German shepherd sat beside Ethan every morning, watching him prepare coffee over a small camp stove and waiting patiently for another day to begin. Ranger did not care about Ethan's circumstances. He did not see a man who had fallen behind. He saw his companion, his family, his home. That afternoon, the desert weather changed quickly. Dark clouds gathered above the mountains, and the peaceful air became colder. Ethan decided to move farther along an old trail to find a safer place before the storm arrived. Ranger walked ahead, his paws pressing into the dusty ground as the wind grew stronger. The trail was barely visible, forgotten by time, and covered by years of sand. Ethan had never planned to follow it. But Ranger suddenly stopped. The German shepherd stood completely still, looking toward a section of the desert floor where nothing seemed unusual. Ethan watched him carefully. "What is it, boy?" Ranger moved closer to the ground and began sniffing around a large patch of rocks. Ethan walked over, curious but unsure. At first, he saw nothing. Just stones, dust, and the endless desert. Then he noticed something beneath the sand. A small piece of curved wood. Ethan knelt down and brushed away the dirt with his hands. The shape became clearer. It was not a fallen branch. It was part of something made by people. Something old. Something forgotten. As the wind cleared more dust away, Ethan saw the edge of a large wooden wheel. His heart slowed for a moment. He had seen old photographs of these before. A stagecoach wheel, buried beneath the desert floor. Ranger stood beside him, watching quietly as Ethan uncovered more of the discovery. The wood was aged, but the craftsmanship was still visible. This was not just abandoned equipment. This was history. Ethan looked across the empty landscape and wondered how long it had been waiting there. Decades? Maybe longer. He carefully moved more sand away and discovered the outline of an entire stagecoach hidden beneath the earth. The desert had protected it like a secret. The afternoon light reflected against the old metal pieces, revealing details that had not been seen for generations. Ethan felt something he had not felt in a long time. Curiosity. Hope. A reason to keep moving forward. Ranger walked around the buried stagecoach and stopped near the back section. He looked toward Ethan, almost as if he knew there was something else waiting. Ethan followed. Behind a damaged wooden panel, he found a small metal container covered in dust. It was sealed tightly. Ethan picked it up carefully. It was heavier than he expected. He looked at Ranger and gave a quiet smile. You always find the things everyone else misses. As the desert storm approached in the distance, Ethan sat beside the forgotten stagecoach and held the mysterious container in his hands. He did not know what was inside. He did not know that this discovery would change everything he believed about his own life. But he knew one thing. After years of feeling invisible, something hidden beneath the desert had finally found him. And inside that old stagecoach was a secret waiting to be opened. The metal container sat in Ethan Walker's hands as the desert wind moved softly around him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was holding something more than an old object. It felt like he was holding a piece of a forgotten story. Ranger stayed close beside him, watching the container with the same quiet attention he had shown when he first discovered the buried stagecoach. Ethan knew he could open it right there beneath the desert sky, but something inside told him to be careful. Some things were not meant to be rushed. As the storm clouds moved closer, Ethan and Ranger returned to their small campsite near the mountains. The old stagecoach remained hidden beneath the desert sand, waiting exactly as it had for more than 100 years. Ethan placed the metal container on a wooden table beside his lantern and studied it carefully. There were no markings that explained where it came from. No name, no date, only a small symbol engraved into the surface. A simple mountain shape with a single line beneath it. Ethan had never seen it before, but somehow it felt familiar. That night, while the rain tapped gently against the roof of his truck, Ethan finally opened the container. Inside was not a pile of gold. Not yet. Instead, he found something much more unexpected. An old leather journal wrapped in cloth, several yellowed letters, and a small brass key. Ethan picked up the journal carefully. The pages were fragile, but the handwriting was still clear. The first page showed a date from over 100 years ago. The name written at the top was Samuel Whitaker. Ethan read the first few lines quietly. The journal belonged to the owner of the Stagecoach, a man who traveled across the western frontier carrying supplies and important documents. But the story quickly became more mysterious. Samuel wrote about a journey that was supposed to be his final trip. He mentioned a hidden responsibility and a promise he made to protect something valuable. Ethan turned each page slowly, feeling more connected to the unknown man with every sentence. Samuel did not write like someone searching for wealth. He wrote like someone trying to make sure the truth survived. Ranger rested beside Ethan's chair, occasionally lifting his head as the pages turned. The German shepherd had no idea what the words meant, but he understood Ethan. He knew when something mattered. The next morning, Ethan decided he needed help understanding what he had found. He drove to the nearest small town and visited the local historical center. That was where he met Clara Whitmore, a historian who had spent years studying forgotten stories from the region. Clara examined the journal, the letters, and the symbol on the metal container. Her expression changed as she recognized the handwriting. "Where did you find this?" she asked softly. Ethan explained how Ranger discovered the stagecoach beneath the desert. Clara looked at the old pages again. She told him that Samuel Whitaker was a name mentioned in several old records. A man who disappeared during a journey that many historians believed ended without answers. The stagecoach had been searched for decades, but nobody ever found it. Until now. Clara carefully opened one of the letters. Inside was a message written by Samuel to someone whose name had been partially damaged by time. The letter mentioned a hidden location and something valuable that needed protection. Ethan looked at the brass key sitting on the table. The discovery was becoming more than a historical mystery. It was becoming a promise from someone who lived a century before him. Before Ethan left the historical center, Clara noticed something else inside the journal. A name written on the final page. A name that made Ethan stop breathing for a moment. The name was Walker, his own family name. As the sun lowered over the desert, Ethan returned to Ranger and the old stagecoach. He looked at the buried wagon, the journal, and the key in his hand. He had spent years believing his past was behind him. But now, a story from 100 years ago had somehow found its way into his life. And hidden inside that story was a connection Ethan never expected to discover. The name written on the final page of Samuel Whitaker's journal stayed with Ethan Walker long after he returned to the desert. Walker, his own family name. A connection that should not have existed, yet somehow appeared inside a story buried beneath the sand for more than 100 years. Ethan sat beside the old stagecoach that evening with Ranger resting near him. The desert sky turned orange as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the quiet around them felt different. It was no longer an empty place. It felt like a place that had been waiting. The next morning, Ethan returned to town and met with Clara Whitmore again. He brought the journal, the letters, and the brass key. Clara carefully studied the documents, comparing the handwriting with old records stored in the historical center. After several hours, she discovered something unexpected. Samuel Whitaker was not only a stagecoach owner. He was also connected to a family line that had helped build several communities across the region. But there was a missing chapter in his story, a chapter involving the disappearance of his final journey. Clara explained that old newspapers from that time mentioned a lost stagecoach carrying valuable materials and important documents. Many people searched for it, believing the wagon contained a fortune, but nobody found anything. The mystery eventually became a forgotten legend. Ethan looked down at the journal. "Why would someone hide all of this?" he asked. Clara opened one of the letters again. She pointed to a sentence written by Samuel. It explained that the value of what he carried was not measured by money. The true importance was protecting something that could help others understand the truth. Ethan thought about those words. He had spent years seeing his own life through what he lacked. A home, stability, a future that felt certain. But Samuel's story reminded him that value was not always something people could see. Sometimes it was hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right person to discover it. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Ranger returned to the Stagecoach site with Clara. The historian wanted to examine the location where the wagon had remained untouched for so long. Ranger walked ahead along the trail, occasionally stopping near areas covered by sand and small rocks. Near the back of the stagecoach, the German shepherd stopped again. Ethan followed his gaze and noticed a section of ground that looked slightly different. Together, they carefully cleared away the loose dirt and found a small wooden compartment beneath the wagon floor. Inside was another collection of letters wrapped in faded fabric. Clara opened the first letter carefully. The handwriting belonged to Samuel. But this time, the message was addressed to someone named William Walker. Ethan felt a quiet shock. William was his great-grandfather's name. The connection was becoming impossible to ignore. Samuel had not randomly left these clues behind. Somehow, he had known that one day someone from the Walker family would find them. The letter explained that Samuel and William shared a friendship built on trust. They had traveled together, helped people in need, and believed that honesty mattered more than personal gain. Samuel wrote that if the stagecoach was ever discovered, the finder should not search only for what was hidden inside. They should search for the reason it was hidden. Ethan read the letter slowly, feeling the meaning behind every word. This was not a story about finding something valuable. It was a story about preserving something meaningful. As the evening approached, Clara noticed the brass key Ethan discovered earlier matched a small lock on the wooden compartment. Inside was a final object wrapped carefully in cloth. Ethan opened it and found a small gold coin with the same mountain symbol engraved on one side. It was beautiful, but the coin itself was not what caught his attention. Beneath it was a handwritten note. Only one sentence. The treasure was never meant to belong to one person. Ethan looked at Ranger. The German shepherd stood beside him, calm and loyal as always. The mystery of the lost stagecoach was growing deeper. The gold had finally appeared, but Ethan knew the real discovery was something much larger. Somewhere in the remaining pages of Samuel's story was the truth about why this treasure had been hidden for a century. The small gold coin rested in Ethan Walker's hand as the desert wind moved across the forgotten trail. It was only a simple piece of metal, worn by time, and covered with the same mountain symbol found on the old stagecoach and the mysterious container. But Ethan knew it represented something far greater than its appearance. It was a piece of a story that had survived for more than 100 years. Ranger sat beside him, watching quietly as Ethan studied the handwritten note beneath the coin. The treasure was never meant to belong to one person. Those words stayed with him. The next morning, Ethan and Clara Whitmore returned to the historical center to continue researching Samuel Whitaker's story. The more they discovered, the clearer the truth became. Samuel was not a man chasing wealth. He was someone who believed that certain things were worth protecting because they carried meaning. Clara found additional records from the early 1900s that mentioned Samuel's friendship with William Walker. The two men had traveled through the region together, helping families and supporting communities during difficult times. They were not famous. Their names were not written in history books, but their actions had left a quiet mark on the people around them. Ethan looked at the old documents and thought about his own life. For years, he believed being forgotten meant he no longer mattered. But Samuel's story showed him something different. Some of the most important people were never remembered because of their wealth or status. They were remembered because of the kindness they left behind. Clara continued searching through the archives and discovered a map hidden inside one of Samuel's letters. Unlike the previous map, this one did not lead to another location. Instead, it showed a symbol that matched the mountain engraving found on the coin. Clara explained that the symbol appeared in several old records connected to a group of people who protected important documents and family histories. This was never about hiding gold, Clara said. It was about protecting a truth. Ethan looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd had been the reason this journey began. Without him noticing something beneath the desert sand, the stagecoach might have remained hidden for another century. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the desert with Ranger and Clara. They followed the markings from the old map to a quiet area several miles from where the stagecoach was discovered. The location seemed ordinary at first. Just rocks, dry land, and endless sky. But Ranger suddenly stopped near a large stone formation. Ethan smiled softly. "You found another one, didn't you?" Beneath the rocks, they discovered a small opening covered by years of dust. Inside was a narrow space containing a wooden box. Unlike the previous discoveries, this box was not filled with objects. It contained memories, old photographs, personal letters, and a journal written by William Walker. Ethan held the journal carefully. Seeing his family name connected to this story felt overwhelming. He opened the first page and found a message written by William himself. He described Samuel as a friend who understood one important truth. A person's greatest legacy was not what they owned when they left this world. It was what they gave to others while they were here. Ethan paused while reading those words. He thought about the years he spent believing he had nothing left to offer. Yet now, standing in the desert with Ranger beside him, he realized he had been carrying something valuable all along. Not money, not possessions, something deeper. The ability to help. The ability to understand others who felt forgotten. As the sun began to set, Clara discovered one final entry in William's journal. It explained that the gold hidden with the stagecoach was never a personal fortune. It was meant to support a cause that Samuel and William believed in, a cause that continued through generations. Ethan looked at the old stagecoach in the distance, and then at Ranger. The mystery was finally revealing its purpose. The gold was not the ending of the story. It was the beginning of something that could change many lives. But before Ethan could understand what Samuel and William truly planned, one final secret remained hidden inside the last pages of the journal. The final pages of William Walker's journal remained closed on the wooden table as the desert night covered the mountains with silence. Ethan Walker sat beside the small lantern outside his truck, with Ranger resting near his feet. The German Shepherd had been there through every discovery, every unanswered question, and every moment when Ethan wondered if the past was trying to tell him something. Now, holding the journal that carried his family name, Ethan felt a connection to people he had never met but somehow understood. The next morning, Ethan and Clara Whitmore carefully continued reading William's journal. The words revealed a story that had been hidden for generations. William explained that the gold carried by the stagecoach was not a personal fortune. It was part of a larger plan created by Samuel Whitaker and several trusted friends. They wanted to create a fund that would support families who had lost everything during difficult times. They believed that wealth only had meaning when it was used to lift others up. Clara looked at Ethan and quietly said, "They protected a treasure because they knew one day someone would need its message." Ethan thought about those words. For years, he had believed that his own story had already ended. After leaving the military and facing years of uncertainty, he felt like a person the world had forgotten. But now he was standing in the middle of a century-old promise, discovering that forgotten people could still make a difference. Together, Ethan, Clara, and Ranger returned to the hidden area near the stagecoach. They searched carefully through the remaining sections of the old wagon and found another small compartment beneath the wooden floor. Inside was an envelope with a faded seal. The seal carried the same mountain symbol that appeared on the coin. Ethan opened it slowly. The letter was written by Samuel Whitaker shortly before his final journey. It was addressed to whoever discovered the stagecoach. Samuel wrote that the person finding it should not think of themselves as an owner, but as a caretaker. The gold was never meant to change one person's life. It was meant to continue a promise started by people who believed kindness could survive longer than any material possession. Ethan read the letter twice. The meaning became clear. The real discovery was not buried beneath the desert. It was carried through generations by people who chose to do what was right. Clara continued studying the documents and found something that surprised her. The records showed that Samuel and William had created a small community fund before the stagecoach disappeared. However, after their disappearance, the records were lost and the project was forgotten. The gold was the missing piece that could restore the original purpose. Ethan looked toward the mountains as the afternoon light covered the desert in warm colors. He imagined Samuel and William traveling across this same land more than 100 years earlier. They had no idea who would eventually find their secret. They only trusted that the right person would understand. Ranger walked slowly toward Ethan and rested his head against his hand. Ethan smiled and gently placed his hand on the dog's fur. "You brought me here for a reason," he whispered. The German shepherd looked back at him calmly, as if the answer had always been simple. As the news of the discovery began spreading, people from the nearby town became curious about the forgotten stagecoach and the veteran who found it. Some wanted to know about the gold. Others wanted to know about the mystery. But Ethan cared about something different. He wanted to honor the promise left behind. Before the story could be completed, one question remained unanswered. Who was the person responsible for protecting the gold for 100 years? And why did the final message seem to suggest that Ethan was never meant to simply find the treasure? He was meant to continue it. The question remained in Ethan Walker's mind as he watched the desert sunrise over the mountains. Who had protected the gold for 100 years? And why did the final message feel like it had been waiting specifically for him? The answers were hidden somewhere between the old documents, the forgotten stagecoach, and the promise made by people who lived a lifetime before him. Ethan, Clara Whitmore, and Ranger returned to the historical center to continue searching through the records. The room was quiet except for the sound of old pages turning. Dust floated through the morning sunlight as Clara carefully organized the letters and journals across the table. She had spent years studying forgotten stories from the region, but she had never seen anything like this. The connection between Samuel Whitaker and the Walker family was becoming clearer with every discovery. After hours of research, Clara found a small reference in an old archive book. It mentioned a person named Henry Walker, William's son, who continued protecting the secret after his father's passing. Ethan listened carefully. His family had carried this story for generations without knowing it existed. Clara explained that Henry never wanted recognition. He simply followed the promise left by his father and Samuel. The gold remained hidden because they believed the right person would understand its purpose one day. Ethan looked at the documents and felt a strange mixture of sadness and gratitude. He thought about how many stories disappeared because nobody took the time to listen. The people from the past were gone, but their kindness was still speaking. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the stagecoach location with Ranger. He wanted to understand why his family had been connected to this mystery. The desert felt different now. It was no longer just an empty place filled with sand and wind. It was a place where memories had been waiting. Ranger walked near the old wagon, moving slowly around the area. Suddenly, the German shepherd stopped beside a section of ground near the stagecoach path. Ethan noticed that Ranger was focused on something beneath a group of stones. He carefully moved the rocks aside and discovered a small metal box hidden underneath. Unlike the previous containers, this one was much smaller and covered with marks from years underground. Ethan opened it and found a collection of photographs. The images showed Samuel Whitaker, William Walker, and several other people standing together beside a small wooden building. Clara examined the photographs later and recognized the location. It was an old community shelter that had disappeared from local records decades ago. The discovery changed everything. The gold was never intended to be a treasure hidden forever. It was meant to rebuild something that had once helped people who had nowhere else to turn. Ethan stared at the photographs for a long time. He saw people who believed that compassion could outlast time itself. He saw a reminder of the values he once lived by as a Marine: duty, honor, service. But now he understood those values were not limited to a uniform. They were choices a person made every day. Ranger rested beside him as the afternoon breeze moved through the desert grass. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's shoulder and smiled. The German shepherd had not found the gold because of luck. He had found the path that led Ethan back to purpose. When the story of the stagecoach discovery reached the nearby community, many people wanted to see the forgotten treasure. Some expected a story about wealth and fortune, but Ethan knew the truth was different. The real discovery was a promise that had survived 100 years. A promise about helping others, protecting memories, and remembering that even forgotten lives still mattered. Yet as Clara reviewed the final documents, she discovered one last detail hidden in the records. The gold was only a portion of what Samuel and William had left behind. Somewhere beyond the desert, another piece of their legacy was still waiting to be found. The desert morning arrived quietly, covering the mountains with a soft golden light. Ethan Walker stood beside the old stagecoach, looking at the place where a century-old promise had been waiting beneath the sand. For most of his life, Ethan believed his story was already written. He thought the best chapters were behind him. But now, with Ranger standing beside him and a forgotten legacy unfolding around him, He began to understand that some journeys begin only after a person believes they are finished. The discovery of the hidden metal box had changed everything. Inside were photographs, records, and memories of a community built on kindness. But Clara Whitmore had discovered something else in the old documents. Another location connected to Samuel Whitaker and William Walker. A place where the final part of their legacy was believed to be hidden. Ethan and Clara spent the next several days studying maps and comparing old landmarks with modern locations. The desert had changed over 100 years, but some things remained the same. A mountain shape, a river path, a trail once used by travelers. Slowly, the pieces began coming together. The final location was not far from where the stagecoach had been discovered. It was a small valley surrounded by tall rocks and forgotten paths. Ethan, Clara, and Ranger traveled there early in the morning. The drive was quiet, but Ethan felt something different inside him. He was no longer searching for gold. He was searching for the meaning behind everything Samuel and William had protected. When they reached the valley, Ranger stepped out first. The German shepherd moved carefully through the dry grass, following scents carried by the wind. Ethan watched him with a small smile. The dog had always seemed to know when something important was nearby. After walking for several minutes, Ranger stopped beside an old wooden structure hidden between the rocks. It was almost impossible to notice from a distance. The building had blended into the landscape for decades, protected by time and nature. Ethan opened the door carefully. Inside, they found shelves filled with old papers, tools, and personal belongings from the people who once cared for this place. Clara looked around with amazement. She recognized the building from one of the photographs. It was the original community shelter Samuel and William had created. The place was not large. It was simple, but every object inside told a story about people who believed helping others mattered. Ethan picked up an old notebook from a wooden table. The pages contained names of families who had received support from the shelter many years ago. Some names were followed by small notes of gratitude. A meal provided, a place to rest, a helping hand during a difficult season. Ethan became quiet as he read the entries. He realized that the true treasure was never something buried underground. It was the kindness that continued from one person to another. Clara discovered one final document hidden inside a drawer. It was written by Samuel shortly before the stagecoach disappeared. The letter explained that the gold was only a tool. The real mission was creating a lasting reminder that people should never be abandoned when life became difficult. Ethan looked around the old shelter and thought about his own journey. He had spent years feeling invisible, believing nobody needed him anymore. But now he stood in a place created by people who believed every person had value. Ranger walked over and rested beside him. Ethan placed his hand gently on the dog's head. "You knew before I did," he whispered. As the sun moved across the valley, Ethan made a decision. The gold would not become a symbol of personal wealth. It would become part of the promise Samuel and William started long ago. News of the discovery spread through the community, and people began seeing Ethan differently. He was no longer just the homeless veteran living near the desert. He was the person who helped return a forgotten story to the world. But as Clara reviewed the final pages of Samuel's records, she noticed something unexpected. The amount of gold recovered was only part of what had been hidden. One final piece of the treasure was still missing, and the clue leading to it was connected to Ranger's very first discovery beneath the desert sand. The final clue remained hidden inside the old stagecoach, waiting quietly beneath the same desert sky where Ethan Walker first discovered it. For days, Ethan, Clara Whitmore, and Ranger had uncovered pieces of a story that had survived more than 100 years. They found the letters, the journals, and the forgotten shelter that revealed Samuel Whitaker and William Walker's true purpose. But one question remained. Where was the last part of the treasure, and why had it been hidden so carefully? Clara returned to the historical center and reviewed every document connected to the stagecoach. She noticed a small detail in Samuel's final letter that everyone had overlooked. The message mentioned that the final piece would only be found by someone who followed the first sign. Ethan immediately knew what Samuel meant. The first sign was the place where Ranger discovered the buried wagon. Without that moment, none of this would have happened. The next morning, Ethan returned to the original discovery site with Ranger. The desert was calm, and the early sunlight covered the ground with a warm glow. The old stagecoach remained exactly where it had been uncovered, a silent reminder of the story hidden beneath it. Ranger walked around the wagon slowly, following the same path he had taken on that first day. Ethan watched closely. The German shepherd stopped near one of the old wooden wheels and looked toward a small section of earth nearby. Ethan smiled softly. You remembered. He carefully cleared away the sand and discovered a small wooden marker buried beneath the surface. It was not made of gold. It was not valuable because of its material, but it carried the same mountain symbol that appeared on every clue they had found. Clara examined the marker and discovered that it was actually a guide. It pointed toward a location several miles away, deeper into the desert. Ethan, Clara, and Ranger followed the direction before sunset. The path led them to a quiet area surrounded by tall rocks. There was no sign that anything important existed there. No building. No visible treasure. Only desert wind moving through the landscape. But Ranger continued forward until he reached a small opening between two large stones. Hidden inside was a narrow space protected from the elements. Ethan entered carefully and found an old wooden chest covered with dust. This was different from everything they had discovered before. It felt like the final chapter of a story that had waited patiently to be completed. Inside the chest were several gold pieces, but Ethan barely looked at them. What caught his attention was a folded document placed carefully on top. Clara opened it with trembling hands. The document explained everything. Samuel and William had hidden the gold in separate locations because they wanted to protect the purpose behind it. They knew that wealth could disappear quickly, but a message of kindness could continue forever. The gold was meant to restore the community shelter and support people who needed a second chance. Ethan looked at Ranger as the meaning settled in his heart. The dog had not led him to riches. He had led him to a reminder that his life still had purpose. That night, Ethan sat beside the campfire with Ranger resting nearby. The desert stars filled the sky above them. For the first time in many years, Ethan did not feel like someone who had been left behind. He felt connected. Connected to the people who came before him. Connected to the community waiting to hear this story. Connected to the loyal companion who never judged him. When the discovery became public, people from nearby towns gathered to learn about the forgotten Stagecoach and the century-old promise. Many expected a story about gold. Instead, they found a story about compassion. They saw a veteran who had been overlooked become the person who brought hope back to a forgotten place. But Ethan knew the journey was not finished. The treasure had been found, but the greatest decision was still ahead. The gold could change his own life forever, or it could continue the promise that began with Samuel and William more than 100 years ago. The morning after the final discovery, Ethan Walker sat quietly beside the old stagecoach and watched the desert sunlight spread across the land. The golden glow touched the wooden wheels, the faded metal, and the path where a forgotten story had finally returned to the world. For more than 100 years, the stagecoach had remained hidden. The people who protected its secret were gone, but their promise had survived. Now the responsibility had reached Ethan. He held the final document in his hands and read the words one more time. The message from Samuel Whitaker was simple. The treasure was never meant to change one person's life. It was meant to remind people that kindness could travel farther than money ever could. Ethan looked toward Ranger, who was resting beside him. The German shepherd had been there from the beginning. He found the first clue beneath the desert sand. He guided Ethan through every uncertain moment. He never cared about the gold. He only cared about staying beside the person who needed him most. After years of feeling forgotten, Ethan finally understood something important. Ranger had not just helped him find a hidden treasure. He had helped him find himself again. When Ethan returned to town with Clara Whitmore, the community gathered to hear the story. Many people arrived expecting to see a fortune. They wanted to know how much gold had been discovered and what would happen next. But Ethan did not stand before them as a wealthy man. He stood there as someone who had discovered a purpose. He shared the story of Samuel and William. He explained how the gold was created to support people during difficult times. He told them about the forgotten shelter, the old letters, and the promise that had survived through generations. The people listening began to understand that this was not a story about treasure hidden beneath the desert. It was a story about people choosing to care for one another. Ethan made his decision. The gold would be used to restore the old community shelter and create a place where veterans and struggling families could find support. A place where nobody would feel invisible. a place built on the same values that Samuel and William believed in. Some people were surprised. They thought Ethan would use the discovery to finally live a comfortable life after years of hardship. But Ethan knew something they did not. A person could own gold and still feel empty. But a person who helped others could carry a treasure that never disappeared. Months later, the old shelter was restored. The building was simple, but it became a place filled with warmth and kindness. Veterans visited. Families found help. People who once felt forgotten discovered that someone still cared. Ethan never looked for recognition. He continued living quietly, with Ranger always beside him. The German Shepherd became known throughout the community as the dog who found a century-old secret. But to Ethan, Ranger was never just the dog who found the gold. He was the friend who stayed when the world had turned away. One evening, Ethan returned to the desert with Ranger. They stood near the restored stagecoach, watching the sunset disappear behind the mountains. The old wagon remained as a reminder of everything that had happened. A reminder that some things are hidden not because they are meant to be lost, but because they are waiting for the right person to discover them. Ethan placed his hand on Ranger's collar and smiled. The journey that began with loneliness had ended with connection. The man who believed he had nothing left to give had given hope to many others. The dog who followed a scent beneath the sand had helped uncover something far greater than gold. Because the greatest treasures are not always buried in the earth. Some are found in loyalty, some are found in compassion, and some are found when two forgotten souls find their way home together.